Let me start tonight with something that ought to wake up every American who's been lulled into thinking this rivalry with China is just another foreign policy headline. Not long ago, a U.S. reconnaissance plane flying legally over the South China Sea had a Chinese fighter jet swing so close across its nose that the American pilot said he could see the other man's helmet. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a message. Beijing was saying, we can reach you whenever we want. And if you think that kind of stunt can't turn into a full-blown crisis, remember, wars have started over less. I'll tell you this, what we're seeing now is not a return to the Cold War. It's a new model of competition for a new century. The Soviet Union tried to outgun us. China is trying to outbuild us, outcode us, and outthink us by their rules. They're not rolling tanks through Berlin. They're rolling out 5G networks, microchips, and supply chains that wrap around the planet. That's the new arsenal of power. According to the Wall Street Journal, China's exports of critical minerals, rare earths used in everything from fighter jets to electric vehicles fell by more than 80% last month after new U.S. controls. That's not a coincidence. Beijing is using its chokehold on materials to send a warning. If we press too hard on technology, they'll squeeze us where it hurts. And according to Reuters, our own Commerce Department has just expanded export restrictions to cut China off from the next generation of AI chips. These are not symbolic moves. They're the 21st century version of sanctions and blockades. Now here's what worries me. For years, the American foreign policy establishment, Republican and Democrat alike, told us that if we just traded enough, if we opened enough factories in China, they'd become more like us. More open, more democratic, more respectful of human rights. Remember that? Well, Beijing took the trade, took the capital, and built a surveillance state with our technology. They built missiles aimed at our allies with profits from our markets. The New York Times recently quoted a senior Chinese official saying, "The era of Western dominance is over." That's not analysis, that's a declaration. And you and I both know that when authoritarian regimes start believing their own propaganda, the rest of the world pays the price. I've met with Chinese dissidents who risk their lives to speak the truth about what's happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. They'll tell you, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't compromise, it waits you out, it smiles at summits, it signs memoranda, and it plays for time. Every handshake comes with a catch. But let's be fair, the American people are not blameless. We outsourced our manufacturing base for short-term profit and cheap labor. We told ourselves efficiency was the same thing as security. We let entire towns hollow out while China built industrial fortresses. And now we're realizing too late that the middle of America can't depend on the middle of the Pacific. Take a simple example. A father in Michigan told AP News he waited 6 months for parts to repair his pickup truck because the electronic control units were stuck at a port in Shenzhen. 6 months. For a part that used to cost $50, when he finally got it, the price had doubled. That's not globalization working, that's dependency showing its teeth. I've always believed free markets are the engine of prosperity. But free markets require fair play, and what we have with China is not free trade, it's state-subsidized manipulation. They steal intellectual property, flood markets with below-cost goods, and punish companies that speak out. That's not capitalism, that's economic warfare. Now, some in Washington will say, Senator, you're being alarmist, we're just competing, not confronting. But competition without boundaries is a road to submission. If your competitor cheats, steals, and spies, and you do nothing, you're not competing, you're conceding. And when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, complacency is concession. Let's talk about power for a moment. Not moral power, not soft power, but real power. The kind that comes from control over energy, resources, and information. Beijing understands that perfectly. That's why they're building ports in Africa, laying railways through Central Asia, and locking up lithium mines in South America. The Financial Times noted last week that Chinese firms now control or finance more than 60% of the world's battery supply chain. 60%. If you think that's about climate, you're missing the point. It's about leverage. Whoever controls energy technology controls the future. But I want to be crystal clear here. The problem is not the Chinese people. They are talented, hardworking, and ambitious. The problem is the Communist Party that rules them, the same party that lies about COVID, that censors its own citizens, that threatens Taiwan, that spies on American soil through corporate front doors. Here's the reality. The United States is not looking for a fight, but we can't afford to ignore one when it's already in progress. The new Cold War won't be declared with a speech. It's being declared every time a cyber attack hits an American hospital, every time a U.S. company is forced to hand over its source code to do business in China, every time a dictator in Beijing tells the world democracy is obsolete. I believe in peace through strength. It worked before, and it can work again, but only if we stop pretending that our adversaries think like we do. They don't. The Chinese Communist Party sees compromise as weakness. It respects one thing: resolve. That's why deterrence matters and why rebuilding American strength, economic, military, moral, isn't a slogan. It's survival. So when people ask me, Senator, are we in a new Cold War? I answer this way. Whether we call it that or not, Beijing already has. The question isn't whether we're in one, it's whether we're ready for it. You know, when I first came to the Senate, there were still folks in both parties who genuinely believed that China could be persuaded through engagement, through trade, to become what they called a responsible stakeholder. It was a nice phrase. It sounded sophisticated. But let's be honest, it was wishful thinking dressed up as policy. We assumed that as China got richer, it would get freer. Instead, what we got was the opposite. A nation that used wealth to tighten its grip, not loosen it. Think about it. In the late 1992s and early 2000s, American policymakers, Democrats and Republicans, were falling over themselves to bring China into the World Trade Organization. The argument went that if we welcomed them into the global economy, they'd play by global rules. That experiment is over. Reuters just reported that Chinese state subsidies to heavy industry are higher today than they were when Beijing first joined the WTO. Their trade practices haven't converged with ours. Ours have bent to theirs. And let's talk about intellectual property theft. The Wall Street Journal estimates that U.S. firms lose somewhere between $225 and $600 billion a year from Chinese industrial espionage. That's everything from biotech to aerospace to AI. When you steal someone's research, you're not competing, you're hijacking. And the people paying for it aren't the elites in Washington. It's the innovators, the small businesses, the engineers whose livelihoods depend on honest competition. I'll never forget meeting a group of startup founders in Austin a couple of years back. One of them, a young guy in his 30s, showed me a product he'd designed, a specialized drone component. A few months after he presented at a trade show in Shanghai, a nearly identical version appeared online, sold at half the price, with a different brand name. He told me, Senator, it's like they were inside my laptop. That's the kind of theft we're dealing with. It's not theoretical, it's personal. Meanwhile, in Beijing, they frame this whole debate as if America's the one trying to hold them back. State media calls our export controls containment. The Chinese Communist Party wants the world to believe they're the victim. That narrative plays well at home, but it's nonsense. Nobody forced them to censor the internet, imprison religious minorities, or militarize artificial islands in the South China Sea. Those are choices of power, not reactions to persecution. And while we've been arguing among ourselves left versus right, globalist versus populist, Beijing's been moving. They're building alliances with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They're selling surveillance systems to Africa and Latin America. Politico noted last week that more than 30 developing nations now use Chinese-made digital monitoring networks. Think about what that means. We're not just talking about trade anymore. We're talking about a new export authoritarian technology spreading the model of control. Now, you might hear people say, well, Senator, decoupling from China will hurt our economy. Sure, in the short term, yes. But what's the cost of dependence? Imagine if tomorrow Beijing decided to cut off our access to pharmaceuticals. We import roughly 90% of our antibiotics from China. 90%. You want to talk about national security? That's it. You can't defend a country that can't even make its own medicine. And here's the irony that few in Washington want to admit. We're funding our own vulnerability. Every year, American investors pour billions into Chinese companies, some of which are directly linked to the People's Liberation Army. The Financial Times ran a report detailing how U.S. Pension funds are still exposed to Chinese firms on the Department of Commerce's entity list. We're financing the very apparatus that threatens us. That's not strategy, that's insanity. Look, I'm not saying we should retreat from the world. America leads best when we engage, when we compete, but on fair terms. The solution isn't isolation, it's reorientation. Bring supply chains home. Strengthen alliances with nations that share our values. Japan, South Korea, India, Australia. Build, don't beg. That's the American way. And part of that strategy means telling hard truths. For too long, we've let corporate America chase quarterly profits while outsourcing our future. The CEOs of some of the largest companies in the country stood on stage in Beijing, smiling for photos, pretending everything was fine. I get it, there's money to be made. But here's the question. At what cost? When you're dependent on an authoritarian regime for your bottom line, you're not in business, you're on a leash. The New York Times ran a story not long ago quoting a former trade negotiator who said, "We thought the Chinese system would adapt to us. Instead, we adapted to them." That's the heart of the problem. We keep playing defense in a game they've already rewritten. Let me give you another example. During the pandemic, when global shipping was paralyzed, China quietly bought up strategic stakes in dozens of ports from Africa to Europe to South America. Today, Chinese companies own or operate terminals in over 90 ports worldwide. The BBC called it a maritime web of influence. That's not an accident. That's strategy. They're not thinking in election cycles, they're thinking in generations. So the question is, what are we thinking about? Are we planning for the next century or just the next news cycle? Because if we don't start thinking long term, we're going to wake up one morning and realize we're living in a world built by someone else's blueprint. Here's the simple truth. The Chinese Communist Party has studied America's strengths and our weaknesses for decades. They know we're divided, they know we're distracted, and they're betting that we won't get serious until it's too late. I refuse to let that happen. We need a new consensus, one that says our national security, our workers, and our sovereignty come before corporate convenience. That's not radical, that's patriotism. And it starts with understanding that this rivalry isn't about hatred, it's about survival. Freedom has competitors, and we'd better start acting like it. When you strip away the headlines, the tweets, and the talking points, what we're really fighting for here is the ability to decide our own future. That's what sovereignty means. And I'll tell you this, China understands that better than we do. They've built an entire system designed to make other nations dependent on them so that Beijing can quietly shape their decisions without ever firing a shot. That's not an accident. That's the strategy. Let's start with the most important resource in modern power, semiconductors. Every advanced system from your iPhone to a guided missile depends on chips. Without them, nothing runs. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors come from Taiwan. Think about that. One small island sitting 100 miles off China's coast makes the building blocks of the entire digital age. Beijing knows it. Washington knows it. Every tech company on earth knows it. That's why Taiwan isn't just a diplomatic issue, it's the fault line of the 21st century. When China says it wants reunification, they mean control of that technology. When the United States says it's committed to Taiwan's defense, we're not just defending democracy, we're defending the modern economy. That's what makes this new Cold War different from the old one. The Soviet Union was an ideological rival. China is a supply chain rival. It's not about missiles in Cuba, it's about chips in Tainan. Now, the Biden administration has taken some steps in the right direction. The CHIPS and Science Act, for example, invests in semiconductor production here at home. I supported parts of that effort. But it's not enough to throw money at the problem. We need accountability. We need to ensure that taxpayer dollars aren't just subsidizing giant corporations that still manufacture in China. If we're rebuilding America's industrial base, let's make sure it's actually American. And this isn't just about chips. Look at rare earth elements, the minerals that make everything from fighter jets to wind turbines work. Reuters reported last month that China now refines nearly 70% of the world's lithium and cobalt. That means they can turn the tap on or off whenever they want. They've already done it once, cutting off exports to Japan during a dispute over the East China Sea. If they're willing to do that to an ally of the United States, imagine what leverage they think they have over us. Meanwhile, we're still debating whether it's protectionist to build mines in Nevada or processing plants in Texas. Let me be blunt. It's not protectionism to protect yourself. Every nation has a right and an obligation to secure its own critical resources. The alternative is dependency, and dependency is the first step toward defeat. But economic power alone doesn't tell the whole story. Beijing is also playing a long game in information controlling not just what its citizens hear, but what we hear. They've spent billions funding global media outlets, academic programs, and online influencers who parrot the party line. The Financial Times noted that Chinese state-linked groups now operate social media accounts in multiple languages, targeting American voters with subtle, polished disinformation. This isn't your grandfather's propaganda. It's algorithmic, data-driven, and disguised as opinion. You and I both know that the strength of America lies in our open debate, our free press, our right to dissent, but openness without vigilance is vulnerability. When universities take money from Beijing-backed institutes to host cultural exchanges, that's not education, it's infiltration. When Hollywood studios change scripts to please censors in Shanghai, that's not diplomacy, it's submission dressed as art. And let's not forget cyber warfare. The BBC reported that Chinese hackers have targeted American infrastructure from power grids to government email servers over the past year. These aren't pranksters in a basement, they're state-backed professionals testing the armor of our nation one line of code at a time. A single successful breach could cripple our energy systems, hospitals, or airports. That's the new battlefield: digital, invisible, relentless. Here's what I find most remarkable. While all this is happening, Beijing continues to present itself as a champion of peace and cooperation. They talk about win-win partnerships, about mutual respect. But ask the Philippines how mutual it feels when Chinese ships ram their fishing boats in the South China Sea. Ask Australia how respectful it felt when Beijing slapped trade bans on their exports after they called for a COVID origins investigation. The pattern is clear. Cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party means playing by their rules or being punished. Now, America doesn't need to mimic their tactics. We don't need censorship or control to win this competition. What we need is clarity and courage. We need to say what we mean, enforce our laws, and stop funding our own decline. That means securing our borders and our bandwidth, protecting our data and our factories. It means teaching our kids not just coding, but critical thinking, because the next generation won't just inherit this rivalry, they'll have to navigate it. Let me tell you a story that stuck with me. A friend of mine runs a small manufacturing plant in Ohio, old school, family business, 50 employees. During the pandemic, his supplier in Guangdong shut down. He tried to move production home, but the machines he needed were built only in China. He said to me, "Ted, I can't make an American product without Chinese parts." That sentence should never be true in this country, but it is, and it's not his fault. It's ours for letting it happen, for calling dependence efficiency, for confusing convenience with strength. This isn't about fear-mongering, it's about foresight. The Chinese Communist Party has made its intentions clear. They want to dominate the technologies of tomorrow. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, green energy, biotech, you name it. If they win that race, they won't just write the code, they'll write the rules. And once those rules are set, it won't be freedom leading the world, it'll be control. So, my friends, the stakes are higher than economics or politics. They're civilizational. The question is simple. Will the future be shaped by free people, accountable governments, and open debate, or by an empire that silences dissent and rewrites history to suit its own ends? I believe America can still lead, but only if we stop assuming leadership is our birthright. It has to be earned, defended, renewed. That's the task of this generation. And it starts by facing the reality that the new Cold War isn't coming, it's already here. Let's talk about geography, because geography still matters. Even in the age of satellites and smartphones, you can't understand this new Cold War without understanding the map. Pull out a globe, and you'll see it right away. The Pacific isn't just water, it's a chessboard. And on that board, China has been moving its pieces steadily for years while Washington was busy debating whether the board even existed. Look at the first island chain, the arc running from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines down to Indonesia. That line defines the boundary between open Pacific waters and the coastal seas China claims as its own. For decades, the U.S. Navy operated freely there, keeping sea lanes open for everyone. Today, the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, has more ships than we do. They may not all be as advanced, but quantity has a quality of its own. They've turned reefs into airfields, sandbars into fortresses, and civilian fishing vessels into paramilitary fleets. The BBC recently ran a report showing satellite images of new runways in the Spratly Islands runways that didn't exist 5 years ago. That's what they call gray zone warfare. Actions too aggressive to ignore, but just subtle enough to avoid triggering a military response. Beijing's counting on our hesitation. Every time we wait, they build. Every time we protest, they pour more concrete. Meanwhile, our allies, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, are watching closely. They're asking the same question: if China pushes, will America stand firm? Because here's the truth. Credibility is the currency of deterrence. If our allies stop believing we'll keep our promises, the entire Pacific order unravels. That's why presence matters. That's why we have Marines in Okinawa and carriers in Guam. The deterrent effect doesn't come from press releases, it comes from steel in the water. Now, there are people who say, Senator, why should we care about islands halfway across the world? Fair question. The answer is simple. If Beijing controls those waters, they control global trade. 40% of world commerce passes through the South China Sea. Every ship carrying oil, food, electronics, every container that ends up in an American port moves through that corridor. Control it, and you don't just control ships. You control prices, you control access, you control leverage. The Wall Street Journal pointed out last week that Beijing is testing new anti-ship missiles designed to keep U.S. carriers out of striking range. It's called area denial, and it's working. Their message is clear: stay out of our backyard. But the Pacific isn't anyone's backyard, it's the world's highway. And the day we start accepting that kind of territorial bullying is the day we stop being a superpower. At the same time, we can't pretend that the only front is military. There's an economic flank to every naval maneuver. When the U.S. Navy conducts a freedom of navigation patrol, Beijing doesn't just send ships, they send trade threats. Ask Australia. When they called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID, China slapped tariffs on their wine, barley, and coal. Politico called it economic coercion through commercial instruments. I call it gangster diplomacy. You don't have to fire a shot when you can starve your neighbor's exports. And let me tell you something, our farmers, our manufacturers, our tech companies, they see what's happening. They're not naive. They know a market of 1.4 billion consumers looks tempting, but they also know that a partner who weaponizes trade isn't a partner. He's a predator. I've spoken to ranchers in Texas who watch their feed prices jump because of global ripple effects from these tensions. This rivalry may start in the Pacific, but it lands right here at home in grocery bills and gas prices. Now, I want to be clear, America doesn't need war to win. What we need is resolve. Peace through strength still works. Ronald Reagan proved it. But strength today looks different. It's not just aircraft carriers. It's microchips, alliances, energy independence, and moral clarity. If we project weakness, we invite aggression. If we project confusion, we invite miscalculation. And that's how wars begin, not with a deliberate choice, but with a tragic mistake. There's a story I often think about. In 2001, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet near Hainan Island. The American crew made an emergency landing. Beijing detained them for 11 days. It was a tense standoff, but both sides pulled back. Now imagine that same incident today, same collision, same diplomacy, but this time add Twitter, viral footage, nationalist outrage, and an election year in both countries. How much harder would it be to de-escalate? That's the world we live in now. Instant reaction, zero patience, maximum pride. And pride, especially national pride, is a powerful thing. The Chinese Communist Party has built its entire legitimacy on the story of humiliation and resurgence. They tell their people, the West held us down for a century, now it's our turn. That's the emotional fuel behind their policies. They don't see these moves as aggression, they see them as restoration. That's what makes the situation so dangerous. When both sides think they're defending what's rightfully theirs, compromise feels like surrender. But that's where leadership matters. Our job isn't to mirror China's nationalism, it's to stand for something better. The American model has always been freedom secured by courage and law, not fear enforced by control. We don't need to occupy the world, we need to inspire it. That's how we built alliances after World War II, and that's how we can rebuild them now. The good news is we're not alone. Japan is rearming for the first time in decades. The Philippines has reopened bases to U.S. forces. India is strengthening cooperation through the Quad. Reuters called it a quiet coalition of democracies forming in response to China's rise. That's not containment, that's convergence. Free nations choosing to stick together because they know the alternative. The question is whether we'll keep leading that effort or let it drift. History tells us the cost of indecision is always higher than the cost of preparation. I'd rather America be ready and never have to fight than caught unready and forced to. The Pacific might seem far away, but the balance of power there will decide whether this century belongs to liberty or control. I know which side I'm on, and I believe the American people do too. You know, one of the biggest mistakes we've made in Washington is assuming that this rivalry is just about the U.S. and China. It's not. The rest of the world is watching, calculating, adjusting. Every capital from New Delhi to Berlin to Brasilia is trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing. And here's the truth. Leadership abhors a vacuum. If America steps back, Beijing steps in. It's that simple. Look at Asia. Our allies there, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, are quietly rearming, not because they want to, but because they have to. They see what China's doing. They see ships swarming near their islands, trade routes threatened, and promises from Beijing that sound more like warnings. Reuters ran a piece last week describing how Japanese defense spending is projected to double over the next 5 years. That's not just economics, that's alarm. They know that if Taiwan falls, the entire regional order falls with it. And India is playing the long game. Prime Minister Modi understands that India's future depends on keeping China in check. That's why they're strengthening ties with us through the Quad, an alliance of democracies including Japan and Australia. It's not a NATO of the Pacific yet, but it's moving that direction. As the Wall Street Journal put it, this isn't about confrontation, it's about preparation. Now, Europe's waking up too, though slowly. For years, the EU saw China as a trade opportunity. Cheap goods, easy investment, no questions asked. But after COVID, after the revelations about supply chain dependencies, after Russia invaded Ukraine with Beijing's rhetorical support, Europe's starting to see the picture more clearly. The Financial Times reported that the European Commission now labels China a systemic rival. Those are strong words from Brussels and long overdue. Even Africa and Latin America regions that Washington too often overlooks are becoming arenas of competition. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured trillions into ports, railways, and digital infrastructure across dozens of developing nations. It looks generous on paper, but ask the countries that took those loans how it feels now. BBC News interviewed leaders in Kenya and Zambia who admitted they're drowning in debt from Chinese projects. When the lender controls your ports and your power plants, you're not a partner, you're a client. That's the quiet colonization of the 21st century. Let me be clear. America doesn't need to imitate that model. We don't need to buy friends with debt traps. What we need is credibility, the kind that comes from reliability and respect. When we promise support, we deliver. When we talk about freedom, we mean it. That's why our partnerships endure while Beijing's are fragile. Their deals are transactional, ours are transformational. But we have to earn that credibility again. Too many of our allies look at Washington and see dysfunction. They see us fighting among ourselves, lurching from one administration to the next with wildly different foreign policies. They wonder whether America can still lead consistently. That doubt is dangerous. Deterrence isn't just about power, it's about predictability. Our friends need to know that America's word means something, no matter who's in the White House. And while we're rebuilding trust abroad, we have to rebuild resilience at home, because foreign policy starts in factories and farms, not embassies. If we can't make what we need, we can't protect what we have. I said this before, but it bears repeating. Energy independence, manufacturing strength, secure borders, those aren't just domestic issues. They're national security issues. The Associated Press ran a piece on how energy prices in Europe soared when Russia cut gas supplies. That's what dependency looks like. We can't afford to repeat that mistake with China. Now, let's talk about Latin America for a moment. While Washington was distracted, Beijing moved in quietly, offering loans and infrastructure projects to countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And those deals come with strings, digital access, resource control, even military cooperation. The New York Times reported that Chinese companies now operate space tracking stations in South America. Think about that. Facilities that could collect intelligence on U.S. satellites built under the banner of scientific cooperation. That's how influence expands, not with armies, but with antennas. And it's not just geopolitics, it's culture too. China's exporting its narrative through film, media, and education. They're telling their story, and they're shaping how the next generation sees power. The Financial Times recently highlighted a rise in pro-China content across African social media platforms. Slick, polished, persuasive. That's soft power in action. And if we're not offering an alternative vision, one grounded in truth and liberty, we're conceding the field. You and I both know America's power isn't just measured in aircraft carriers or dollars. It's measured in trust. When we liberated Europe, when we rebuilt Japan, when we stood with South Korea, we didn't just win wars, we won respect. And that respect turned into a network of allies that still shapes the world today. That's our inheritance, but it's not guaranteed. There's a story from the early days of the Cold War that I think about often. In 1948, when Soviet forces blockaded Berlin, the United States didn't respond with threats, we responded with planes. For almost a year, American pilots flew supplies into that city day and night. We didn't ask for thanks, we asked for trust, and we earned it. That's how you build alliances, not through fear, but through faithfulness. Now imagine a modern version of that. Maybe one day, instead of flying food into Berlin, we're flying vaccines into Manila or microchips into Taipei. The principle is the same. When free nations face pressure, America shows up. Not as a conqueror, but as a friend. That's how we outlast autocracies. Not by mirroring their control, but by modeling our conviction. Here's the bottom line. The United States cannot win this new Cold War alone, and China knows it. They're counting on dividing us, splitting NATO, isolating Taiwan, intimidating the Philippines, pressuring Africa, and buying silence from the Middle East. Their strategy depends on our disunity. That's why our strategy must begin with unity. The next decade will test whether the free world still believes in itself. Do we have the confidence to lead without apology, to defend liberty without hesitation, to compete without losing our soul? I believe we do. But belief alone isn't policy. We've got to back it up with strength, with consistency, and with the courage to say, the age of appeasement is over. There's another battlefield in this rivalry, one that doesn't involve armies or missiles, but minds. It's the fight over stories, identity, and influence. You can call it propaganda, you can call it soft power, but in the end, it's about who gets to define truth. And make no mistake, the Chinese Communist Party is spending billions to make sure their version wins. Now, we Americans have a habit of underestimating that kind of campaign because we think propaganda is old-fashioned, something out of a black and white newsreel. It's not. Beijing's strategy is subtle, modern, and global. They've realized that in the 21st century, controlling the narrative means controlling perception, and perception shapes reality. The Wall Street Journal recently ran a piece describing how Chinese diplomats and state-run media are flooding Western social media platforms with slick videos about prosperity and harmony. On the surface, it looks harmless. Smiling workers, futuristic cities, children waving flags. But beneath that imagery is a message. China's rise is inevitable and resistance is futile. That's not information, that's psychological conditioning. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, I spoke with a university student from Houston who told me her class was using a textbook sponsored by Confucius Institute. She said, "Senator, they make China look perfect, clean, efficient, unified, and America looks chaotic." That's not an accident. It's soft influence creeping into our schools, funded directly or indirectly by Beijing. Reuters revealed last month that several universities have quietly renewed contracts with those same institutes under different names. They closed one door and opened another. This isn't just about education. It's about entertainment, journalism, even social media algorithms. Chinese state companies now own stakes in global movie studios and news outlets. They don't always dictate content, but they don't have to. When Hollywood executives start cutting scenes to avoid offending censors in Shanghai, that's influence without an argument. They're doing Beijing's work preemptively. And then there's TikTok, a platform used by millions of young Americans. On the surface, it's fun, but behind it sits a company legally bound to the Chinese Communist Party. Politico and BBC News have both reported that ByteDance engineers in China have access to U.S. user data. Think about that. A foreign authoritarian regime has potential insight into what our children watch, share, and believe. That's not paranoia, that's prudence. Now, some people roll their eyes when I raise these points. They say, Senator, it's just videos, it's just memes. But here's the truth. Culture is upstream of politics. If you can shape how a generation feels about its own country, if you can convince them that freedom is messy and control is efficient, you don't need to win a war. You've already won the future. Let me put it this way. When I was a kid, the stories we grew up with, movies, books, even cartoons taught us something simple but profound, that freedom matters, that courage matters, that right and wrong exist. Now we're feeding kids content designed to blur those lines. The hero is the one who obeys. The villain is the one who questions. That's not entertainment. It's indoctrination wrapped in pixels. And we shouldn't underestimate the psychological component of China's messaging at home either. The New York Times recently detailed how Beijing's internal propaganda machine frames the U.S. as decadent, divided, and doomed to decline. Every headline, every social media post reinforces that image. It's a mirror they hold up to their citizens saying, see, democracy doesn't work. And here's the kicker, it works. It keeps their population compliant by convincing them there's no better alternative. But there's another side to this story, one that doesn't make headlines. When I meet Chinese students studying here in the United States, I see the difference firsthand. They tell me what it's like to live under censorship, to be told what to think, what to read, what to believe. And when they experience the freedom to debate openly, to criticize leaders without fear, it changes them. That's why Beijing fears open societies, because they're contagious. So how do we respond? Not by copying their control, but by doubling down on our confidence. We have to stop apologizing for who we are. America's not perfect, but we don't disappear people for speaking their minds. We don't jail journalists for telling the truth. We don't rewrite history textbooks to erase our mistakes. We face them. That's the strength of a free nation. And here's something else we can do. Invest in truth. Support independent journalism, real civic education, and critical thinking. Because propaganda only thrives where ignorance grows. When people understand how systems work, when they can tell the difference between information and manipulation, they become immune to control. Now, there's one more layer to this information war that hits close to home. The diaspora. Millions of Chinese Americans contribute enormously to this country as doctors, scientists, business owners, neighbors. But the Chinese Communist Party tries to treat them like extensions of its power. They pressure families, monitor communities, and threaten relatives back home. Reuters revealed earlier this year that Beijing operates police stations abroad, unofficial offices used to intimidate dissidents. One of them was discovered right in New York City. That's not diplomacy. That's espionage wearing a badge. We can't allow that. We need to make it crystal clear that in America, allegiance belongs to the Constitution, never to a foreign party. And at the same time, we must reject any form of suspicion or scapegoating toward Chinese Americans. The enemy is not ethnicity, it's tyranny. We protect liberty by upholding it for everyone, not by compromising it in fear. The information war is real, but we can win it. We win it by living our values louder than they broadcast theirs. We win it by showing that truth, even when messy, beats propaganda when polished. We win it by remembering that the greatest antidote to authoritarianism is authenticity, the kind of honesty that admits flaws and keeps striving anyway. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a struggle between governments. It's a struggle between two ways of seeing the world. One says, obey and you'll be safe. The other says, think and you'll be free. I know which side I'm on, and I trust you do too. When we look back on the first Cold War, it's easy to remember the drama, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Reagan standing at Brandenburg Gate. But behind all that, what really won the day wasn't just weapons or speeches, it was endurance. The American system simply outlasted the Soviet one because it worked better, because freedom proved more adaptable than fear. And as we step deeper into this new era of competition, we'd better remember that lesson. In the long run, systems built on control collapse under their own weight. The trick is living long enough to see it happen. Now, I hear people say, Senator, you can't compare China to the Soviet Union. Fair point. The Soviet Union was an isolated, militarized bloc. China is a global economic engine woven into every supply chain on Earth. The USSR exported ideology. China exports infrastructure. But the underlying dynamic is the same. A centralized power trying to bend the world to its image, and a free society standing in the way. Back in the day, we talked about containment. George Kennan's idea was simple: resist where you must, avoid where you can, and wait for the contradictions of dictatorship to do the rest. It took 40 years, but it worked. The question is, can that kind of patience work now? In a world where information moves at the speed of light, where markets react in seconds, can we think in decades anymore? I think we have to. Here's the reality. The Chinese Communist Party plays a long game. They don't think in terms of elections, they think in eras. Xi Jinping doesn't have to worry about midterms. He's president for life. And that's their advantage. But we have a different one. We can adapt, self-correct, and rebuild because our power doesn't come from control, it comes from consent. We can change course without collapsing. That's the strength they'll never understand. And there are lessons we should not forget from the original Cold War. One of them is that arrogance kills strategy. The moment we start believing that America's dominance is guaranteed, we lose it. The other lesson is moral clarity. When Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, he wasn't being poetic, he was being accurate. He understood that values aren't just decoration for foreign policy, they are foreign policy. Today, too many leaders tiptoe around the moral dimension. They talk about competition as if it's a sporting event. It's not. This is a struggle between liberty and authoritarianism, between open and closed societies. It's not about who sells more cars. It's about who defines what it means to be free. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't just want to beat America. They want to prove that democracy itself is obsolete. That's their argument to the world, that freedom is inefficient, messy, and weak, and they're pointing at our own division as evidence. So what do? We fix ourselves first. The greatest weapon America ever had was example. When our economy works, when our institutions function, when our politics rise above pettiness, we inspire the world without firing a shot. But when we're consumed by chaos and self-loathing, we hand our adversaries the narrative they crave. The New York Times quoted a senior Chinese official saying, "America is collapsing from within." Well, I don't believe that for a second, but we shouldn't make it easy for them to sell that line. We can learn another lesson from the Cold War. Competition doesn't mean isolation. Back then, we built alliances, NATO and Europe, partnerships in Asia. We invested in education, science, space exploration. We proved that open societies can innovate faster and better than closed ones. That's what the space race was really about. It wasn't just who reached the moon, it was who could harness human potential. And guess what? Freedom won every time. Today's version of that race is digital. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, clean energy, these are the frontiers of power now. If we lead, the world follows our standards. If we lag, we follow theirs. That's why we can't treat education, research, and technology as afterthoughts. They're the arsenal of democracy in the information age. And yet, as I travel across the country, I meet bright young engineers who tell me they're thinking of leaving tech altogether because they don't trust the system anymore. They see universities obsessed with ideology instead of excellence, bureaucracies choking innovation with red tape, and government officials picking winners and losers instead of letting talent thrive. That's not how we win this contest. We win by unleashing the creativity of free people, not micromanaging them from Washington. Now, another difference between the old Cold War and this one is how interconnected the world has become. Back then, the Soviet Union could be walled off. China can't. We trade with them, we study with them, we compete with them on the same platforms. That makes this rivalry more complex, more dangerous, and more personal. It means we can't just contain them, we have to outcompete them. But don't forget, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and yet it still fell apart because no amount of firepower can compensate for a hollow system. A dictatorship can suppress truth for a while, but not forever. Truth leaks, Truth spreads, truth corrodes, lies from within. That's what happened to Moscow. It will happen to Beijing too. The question is how much damage they do before it happens. One of the things I admire about America is our ability to learn from failure. We make mistakes, big ones, but we don't repeat them forever. We learn, we adjust, we move forward. I wish I could say the same for authoritarian regimes. They double down. They punish dissent, purge thinkers, silence innovators. That's why they can't evolve fast enough to survive the pressure of freedom. So here's the moral from history. The freer system always wins, but only if it still believes in its own freedom. We can't outsource that belief to nostalgia or slogans. We have to live it, teach it, defend it. That's how we outlast tyranny, not just with strength, but with soul. And there's something else the Cold War taught us: patience without complacency. We can't panic at every provocation, but we also can't drift into denial. The balance is steadiness, calm where we can be, firm where we must be. That's what kept the peace for 40 years. That's what can keep it again. So let's learn from the past, but not live in it. The tools are different, but the principles are the same. Peace through strength, freedom through faith, and victory through perseverance. The old Cold War ended because one side stopped believing in itself. Let's make sure this time that side isn't us. There's a phrase military strategists use, the escalation ladder. It means that conflicts rarely start at the top, they climb. Step by step, misread intentions, accidental encounters, overreactions, pride. Before you know it, both sides are trapped in momentum they can't escape. That's what keeps me up at night, not the headlines, but the chain of events that could turn this cold rivalry hot in a matter of hours. Let's walk through one. Picture a Tuesday morning in the South China Sea. A Chinese Coast Guard ship harasses a Filipino supply vessel near Second Thomas Shoal. U.S. forces respond with a routine patrol, nothing unusual, but a Chinese jet flies too close, a warning shot is fired, a collision occurs. Suddenly you've got casualties, outrage, and every side's social media lighting up with nationalism. The next move isn't made by generals, it's made by pride. That's how wars begin, not through planning but panic. Reuters recently documented more than 180 unsafe intercepts between Chinese and American aircraft since 2021. Each one could have been the start of something uncontrollable. We should remember that World War I didn't begin with a grand design. It began with one assassination and a cascade of misjudgments. That's the danger now. A system built for deterrence that accidentally creates escalation. But the battlefield today isn't just physical. Cyber warfare means the first strike might not even be visible. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the power grid in Los Angeles or Houston is down, not because of a storm, but because some line of malicious code written in Beijing found its way into a software update. The Wall Street Journal reported just weeks ago that Chinese-linked hackers breached critical infrastructure systems in Guam home to one of our major Pacific bases. The Pentagon said it was pre-positioning for disruption. That's chilling language. It means they're not waiting to start a war. They're preparing to paralyze us before one even begins. Now, add another layer, space. The Financial Times highlighted a recent report showing that China's satellite fleet now outnumbers ours in sheer quantity. Many are dual use officially for weather or communications, but capable of surveillance or even jamming enemy signals. When you control orbit, you control observation, navigation, and time itself. A cyber attack or satellite blackout might not look like Pearl Harbor, but it could have the same effect. So what can we do? First, we have to rebuild deterrence with clarity. That means defining red lines and sticking to them. Ambiguity may sound clever in diplomatic briefings, but it breeds risk. Beijing needs to know exactly what would trigger a response from the United States and what kind of response it would be. During the Cold War, deterrence worked because both sides understood the consequences. Today, we're sending mixed messages. That's an invitation to test our limits. Second, we need resilience. We have to build systems that can take a punch and keep running power grids, communications, logistics, financial networks. If a cyber attack can knock out our hospitals or airports, that's not just an inconvenience. It's vulnerability on a national scale. We need to treat cybersecurity the way we treated nuclear security in the 1,960 seconds, with seriousness, funding, and coordination. Third, we've got to stop relying on luck. Hope is not a strategy. Right now, our entire Indo-Pacific posture relies on the assumption that deterrence will hold indefinitely. But deterrence only works when it's credible. If Beijing thinks we're divided, distracted, or unwilling to act, deterrence dissolves. The BBC quoted a senior PLA general who said, "The Americans are not ready for sacrifice. We'd better make sure he's wrong." And I'm not talking about seeking war, I'm talking about preventing it. The surest way to invite aggression is to convince your enemy you won't fight back. The surest way to keep the peace is to make the price of conflict unbearable. That's what Reagan understood when he rebuilt our military in the 1,980 seconds, not because he wanted to use it, but because he wanted to make sure he never had to. Now, let's be honest. There are voices in Washington that would rather downplay all this. They say confrontation is dangerous, that it's better to manage China through diplomacy alone. I agree, diplomacy matters, but diplomacy without leverage is just talking. The Chinese Communist Party respects strength, it exploits weakness. They don't negotiate from goodwill, they negotiate from calculation. If they sense hesitation, they press. If they sense resolve, they pause. That's the rhythm of their foreign policy. We also have to understand that this competition isn't symmetrical. For us, war is a last resort. For them, coercion is policy. They don't need to invade to win, they just need us to lose confidence. That's what I call silent victory, taking control without confrontation. We've seen it already in Hong Kong. No missiles, no tanks, just pressure, laws, and fear. One day, people woke up and realized freedom had been papered over. The same logic could play out in Taiwan, a blockade, a cyber siege, an embargo disguised as customs enforcement, no invasion necessary, just suffocation. That's how Beijing operates: slow, deniable, effective. Politico recently cited Pentagon war games showing that the first shots in a Taiwan crisis would likely be digital, shutting down ports, scrambling GPS, flooding media with false reports of U.S. retreat. That's the modern battlefield confusion as weapon. So how do we keep that from happening? By keeping our commitments, by making sure our allies know that if they stand, we stand. Nothing deters aggression like certainty, and nothing invites it like doubt. Let me share something a Navy officer told me on a base visit last year. He said, "Senator, we can handle the fight. What scares us is hesitation." That's wisdom from the deck plate level. Those men and women who serve, they don't need perfection from Washington. They need direction. They need to know that the country has their back. We can't control how Beijing acts, but we can control how clearly we communicate our resolve. We can't stop them from trying, but we can make them think twice before they do. That's what deterrence is. That's what peace through strength really means. It's not saber rattling, it's sanity. It's the hard, patient work of preventing war by preparing for it. And I'll end this section with a truth as old as statecraft itself. Weakness tempts aggression, strength sustains peace. We can't afford to forget it now, not when the stakes are this high, not when one miscalculation could set history on fire. Now, some people hear everything I've said so far and they think the only path left is confrontation, that the U.S. and China are destined for conflict. I don't buy that. I believe in strength, but I also believe in prudence. There's still room for cooperation, even between rivals. The challenge is knowing where competition ends and common sense begins. That's the fine line we've got to walk. Take climate. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, clean air and clean water aren't partisan goals. China is the world's largest emitter of carbon. The United States is second. If they don't act, nothing we do matters. But if we think we can trust Beijing's pledges without verification, we're fooling ourselves. The Wall Street Journal reported that while China signs environmental agreements abroad, it's building new coal plants at home faster than any country on earth. They promise green energy for the cameras and deliver black smoke behind the curtain. That's why engagement without accountability doesn't work. Or look at global health. COVID should have taught us one lesson. Transparency saves lives, secrecy kills. Reuters reminded readers just this month that international investigators still haven't been given full access to the Wuhan lab records. That's not science, that's censorship. And yet, we'll eventually need cooperation on future pandemics because viruses don't respect borders. The key is building systems that don't rely on trust, but on truth-independent verification, open data, and real consequences for cover-ups. The same goes for artificial intelligence. Politico recently highlighted a new AI accord being discussed by U.S. and Chinese researchers focused on safety protocols. That's good in theory, but let's be honest, technology is the new nuclear weapon. If we don't lead the way in setting standards, Beijing will. They'll write the rules for digital ethics the same way they've rewritten trade rules by bending them until they break. We can't let that happen. Still, there are areas where limited cooperation serves our interests. Counterterrorism, anti-piracy, nuclear nonproliferation, these are domains where even adversaries can work side by side. During the Cold War, we negotiated arms control treaties with Moscow, not because we trusted them, but because we didn't. Verification kept both sides in check. The same logic applies here. Dialogue backed by deterrence is diplomacy at its best. Dialogue without deterrence is theater. And let's not forget the human side. The Chinese people themselves are not our enemy. They want what every person wants: security, opportunity, dignity. Many of them quietly admire the freedom we take for granted. Every student who studies here, every entrepreneur who visits Silicon Valley, every artist who finds their voice beyond censorship, they're the living proof that truth is magnetic. That's why the Chinese Communist Party fears exposure, not because it weakens them militarily, but because it weakens their story. I'll tell you something that happened a few months ago. I met a group of Chinese dissidents in Washington, men and women who'd risked everything to flee persecution. One of them, a pastor, told me, "Senator, the scariest thing is not their control, it's that they make people believe it's normal." That line hit me hard. Authoritarianism always tries to normalize itself, to make obedience look reasonable, to make silence sound polite. Our job is to make sure the world never mistakes that for stability. We also need to recognize that competition doesn't have to mean hostility. It can mean pressure that drives performance. America becomes sharper when we have something to push against. We discovered that in the space race. We discovered it again in the tech boom. Rivalry can awaken greatness if it's channeled through confidence, not fear. Now, I know there are Americans who are tired of hearing about foreign policy. They say, "Senator, why not focus on home? Why care what happens in the Pacific when we've got problems in Texas, in Ohio, in Detroit?" I get that. But the truth is, you can't separate the two anymore. If Beijing controls the global economy, our jobs depend on their permission. If they control supply chains, our factories are hostage. If they control data, our privacy disappears. Foreign policy starts in your paycheck. It starts in the price of gas, in the cost of groceries, in whether your kids grow up free or indebted to someone else's ambitions. We can and should work with China where it benefits America, but cooperation must always serve freedom, not erode it. There's a difference between partnership and dependency, between negotiation and naivety. The Financial Times put it well, engagement without leverage is submission by another name. That's exactly right. So yes, talk when we can, trade when it's fair, but never, ever confuse peace with passivity. America's strength isn't just measured in missiles, it's measured in mindset. We lead when we believe in the values that made us strong to begin with. The day we start compromising those values for comfort is the day we start losing the competition without even realizing it. There's a balance to strike between confrontation and cooperation, between vigilance and vision. If we get that balance right, we don't just protect America, we preserve the very idea of liberty in a century that's testing it like never before. And I believe we can, because every time freedom has been challenged in history, it's come back stronger, not weaker. The human spirit bends toward liberty, and no party or dictator has ever been able to suppress that forever. So let's keep talking, but from a position of strength. Let's keep trading, but with our eyes open. Let's keep competing, but never forget what makes us worth competing for. When you pull back from all the details, the ships and sanctions, the trade deals and summits, what you really see is a contest of character. This isn't just about GDP or technology, it's about which idea of humanity will shape the next 100 years. One side believes power is the highest good, the other believes freedom is. And I'll tell you this, power can scare people into obedience, but only freedom can inspire them to greatness. That's the heart of the American difference. The world is entering a decade of decision. By the 2030 seconds, the balance of power in Asia will be set. The technologies that define our daily lives, AI, quantum computing, biotech, will have matured. Whoever leads those fields will shape not just markets, but morals. The Wall Street Journal pointed out that China now files more AI patents than any other nation on earth. That's not trivia, that's trajectory. It means they're not waiting for the future, they're coding it. And if we don't catch up, we'll end up living in someone else's design. But here's the good news. America's still ahead where it counts. Our innovation doesn't come from mandates, it comes from imagination. It comes from kids tinkering in garages, from entrepreneurs willing to take a risk, from a culture that rewards questioning instead of punishing it. The Chinese Communist Party can imitate our technology, but it can't imitate our freedom. They can steal our blueprints, but not our spirit. That's what gives me hope. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The ultimate weapon in this new Cold War isn't a missile, it's conviction. Conviction that truth exists, conviction that freedom works, conviction that right and wrong still matter. The moment we lose that conviction, we hand the field over to people who believe in nothing but control. Now, there's a lot of noise in politics today, division, cynicism, fatigue. I get it, but the answer isn't to give up, it's to grow up. We don't have the luxury of apathy anymore. Every generation gets its test. My parents' generation faced the Soviet Union. My generation faces China. The next generation will face something else. The story changes, but the duty doesn't. Defend liberty. So what does that mean in practice? It means building. It means making things again, inventing again, trusting ourselves again. It means securing our borders, balancing our budgets, and teaching our children that America isn't perfect, but it's precious. It means rejecting the idea that patriotism is outdated or naive, because when we stop loving what's good about this country, we stop fighting for it. And I'll tell you what China's leadership is betting, that America no longer has the will to compete. They're betting that we're too divided, too distracted, too self-critical to rise to the challenge. Let's prove them wrong. Let's show them that freedom still produces the strongest societies, the most loyal allies, the most inventive minds. Let's remind the world that moral clarity isn't arrogance, it's guidance. I think about the future a lot. What kind of America will my daughters inherit? Will they grow up in a world where liberty is respected or one where it's rationed? Will we look back and say we met the challenge, or that we hesitated while history moved on without us? I refuse to accept decline as destiny. Decline is a choice, and so is renewal. This rivalry with China doesn't have to end in war, but it does demand will. It demands seriousness from our leaders, honesty from our media, and courage from our citizens. Because at the end of the day, democracy isn't self-sustaining. It depends on people who still believe in it enough to defend it. That's the real test of our time. So here's my closing thought. The new Cold War isn't about hating China. It's about loving freedom. It's about ensuring that no tyrant, no party, no centralized system ever decides the limits of human potential. If we remember that, if we hold fast to what's right and rebuild what's strong, then America will not only endure, it will lead. And when future generations look back on this moment, I hope they'll say we didn't flinch. We faced a powerful adversary, we stood our ground, and we proved once again that free people, united in purpose, can outlast any empire built on fear. That's the legacy I want for this century. And it's worth every ounce of fight we have left,